Local councils across the UK have been making decisions that many residents see as neglecting local needs and heritage. For example, local businesses, especially in rural areas, are also being undermined by council zoning decisions that favour larger corporate chains over small, family-run enterprises. In East Yorkshire, for instance, the influx of large retail parks has crippled high streets. This shift aligns with the Local Government Association's agenda, which advocates for the integration of regional economies into the global market. According to an LGA document, economies of small towns and rural areas are considered less beneficial to the global economy, further justifying such actions. If we can visualise this in real time, we can see that residents were originally supporting local proprietors of general stores. These business owners usually lived within the same area, which helps to support the localised economy. If the general store tenancy is not renewed by the council authority and corporations such as supermarket chains are favoured unfairly, the wealth then leaves the area and smaller business careers suffer. This example also supports the 15-minute city concept perfectly. UK councils are bound by several key pieces of legislation that require them to justify their decisions with clear evidence and engage in public consultations. To name just two, the Local Government Act 1999 places a responsibility on councils to demonstrate best value in their operations, meaning that they must base decisions on concrete data and provide evidence that these decisions are in the public interest. This Act also mandates public consultations to ensure that residents have a voice in the decision-making process. The National Planning Policy Framework, NPPF, is another important regulation, particularly relevant to housing and land use decisions. It requires councils to back their planning decisions with sound evidence, particularly when approving large-scale developments or modifying greenbelt land. Councils must consult with local communities and stakeholders to ensure that their decisions align with broader public interests and environmental considerations. Planning officers and committee members must act with openness in their decision-making regarding all planning applications. UK councils are bound by several key pieces of legislation that require them to justify their decisions with clear evidence and engage in public consultations. To name just two, the Local Government Act 1999 places a responsibility on councils to demonstrate best value in their operations, meaning that they must base decisions on concrete data and provide evidence that these decisions are in the public interest. This Act also mandates public consultations to ensure that residents have a voice in the decision-making process. The National Planning Policy Framework, NPPF, is another important regulation, particularly relevant to housing and land use decisions. It requires councils to back their planning decisions with sound evidence, particularly when approving large-scale developments or modifying green belt land. Councils must consult with local communities and stakeholders to ensure that their decisions align with broader public interests and environmental considerations. Planning officers and committee members must act with openness in their decision-making regarding all planning applications. The declaration of climate emergencies and immigration programs has placed a significant financial burden on local councils and taxpayers. For example, councils such as Bristol and Manchester have received millions of pounds in funding to support their climate emergency efforts. Bristol, for instance, received £4 million to support its net zero agenda. These funds come through schemes such as the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme, which has disbursed hundreds of millions across councils. In 2024 Maidstone Borough Council, Kent has been awarded a Salix Finance Central Government grant of £3.1 million. Residents must pick up the remaining estimated £2.7 million plus pre-contingency to complete the council building's project idea. The new carbon-cutting measures will include the installation of air source heat pumps and solar panels, which, as we have learnt, have been known to include questionable humanitarian manufacturing practices and ironic negative impacts on the natural environment, destroying the planet to save the planet. Similarly, the costs associated with immigration programs are staggering. The asylum accommodation and support contracts, funded by taxpayers, cost an estimated £4 billion annually. Local councils are required to provide housing, social services, and healthcare to asylum seekers, often stretching their budgets and resources to accommodate the influx of immigrants. Additionally, housing programs tied to the climate emergency are also costly. For instance, the Green Homes Grant allocated £2 billion in 2020 to retrofit homes and make them more energy efficient. However, these funds have not been sufficient to address the broader housing crisis. Over 1.2 million households remain on social housing waiting lists, with many British citizens waiting for over 10 years to secure housing. This has led to frustration as funds are directed towards meeting climate goals and supporting and accommodating immigrants, rather than resolving the housing needs of long-term UK residents. The Coronavirus Act 2020 provided local councils with significant powers to impose restrictions aimed at controlling the spread of COVID-19. However, these powers came with the requirement to justify each decision. Councils had to prove that restrictions were necessary, and they continue this trend by declaring questionable and generally invisible emergencies. This provides the perfect criteria to tap into central government funding streams, for them to be seen as mitigating the emergency threat, and in doing so emptying the central budget. Tony Blair's. Government introduced devolution in 1999, creating a parliament in Edinburgh for Scotland, and devolved power to Wales. As we speak, there are approximately 10,000 hyperlocal town and parish councils in England, based within 164 lower tier district councils and 21 upper tier county councils, all with different levels of power and responsibility. The slide may give us an understanding of how this fits together. District and county councils have been consolidating and reshaping. Since the original introduction of devolution, this has recently started to speed up. Now the baton has been passed to the latest enforcers, the latest Labour administration, as part of its relationship to the Levelling Up agenda. As they consolidate to the next level, the new system introduces more influence from non-governmental organisations. Powers and funds are devolved and extracted from the central government. The freedoms of the residents are eroded due to the introduction of fake socialistic communities and citizens' assemblies funded and created to enforce the people's voice or common good, prompting the idea that people will work for the benefit of the community without rights and individualism, as identified in Marxist ideals. Eventually, metro mayors are introduced, and the big decisions are made by one highly paid, globalist, motivated individual, not good for the many. The ideological similarities between Marxist theory and the goals of UK devolution, especially as implemented under Tony Blair's administration, are striking, if not mirrored, directly. For Marx, the centralisation of economic control in the hands of the state was essential for the redistribution of resources. This same centralisation can be seen in the devolution of power to councils, which actually reinforces centralised control at a regional level. Housing and land, which were key areas for redistribution in Marxist thought, also mirror the devolution goals. Councils are increasingly responsible for housing allocation, with significant influence from external bodies like NGOs and stakeholders. This redistribution, driven by central planning, overlooks the needs of long-term residents in favour of new housing developments and climate emergency responses. Finally, both Marxism and devolution, main characteristic is suppressing opposition. In Marxist regimes, dissent is viewed as counterproductive to state goals. Similarly, the devolution agenda sidelines public opinion, especially when local councils push through policies that reflect national or global interests rather than the will of the people. This perceived lack of accountability fuels frustration among those who feel that their voices are being ignored in favour of top-down governance. If we question the narrative or oppose the consensus, we are either hounded or ignored. This is not positive in a democratic society. All voices should be heard, not just those individuals following narratives or being part of a local virtue signalling network. As all voices, being heard encourages true diversity of thought and promotes freedom of speech. We should be pushing back on censorship, calling for more transparency and democratic accountability, and finally saying no to the global to local agenda. For those concerned about the direction that local councils are taking under the influence of unelected NGOs and external stakeholders, there are practical steps you can take to enact real change. Joining political groups like the Heritage Party provides a solution for those who wish to challenge the increasing influence of globalist agendas at the local level. By becoming a councillor, you can directly oppose projects that harm your community's well-being, whether it's the destruction of greenbelt land for housing developments or the implementation of unsustainable immigration policies. I have found it extremely useful to have the backing of a positive group of freedom-loving individuals, not to mention a very clear and authentic manifesto. As mentioned before, opposing the consensus can be lonely to start with, but extremely rewarding in time. Equally important is the need to cut ties with unelected executives and third-party organisations, such as NGOs, that do not have the best interests of residents at heart. Many councils are heavily influenced by these groups, which often pursue climate or migration agendas without regard to local needs. Councillors can work to block funding for such groups and instead ensure that policy is driven by the people, for the people. Moreover, promoting local accountability and ensuring transparency in decision-making are essential. Councils must be held accountable to their residents, not external bodies, by insisting that every policy be justified with legitimate evidence and extensive local consultation. Councillors can ensure that decisions truly benefit the community